What's preventing us from stopping modern day slavery in supply chains? Tom Plotkin is a special counsel with Covington and Burling, LLP. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Robert. Nice to be here.
Yeah, thank you very much for being with me on this very crucial issue of eliminating modern day slavery in supply chains. Of course, these supply chains are made up of vast networks. So, that being the case, what do you see as the biggest obstacles to achieving ethical and responsible sourcing, especially with regard to eliminating forced labor? And how shall those obstacles be addressed?
Sure. Well, supply chains are particularly complex when we look at the global economy and the networks of producers and entities that make up the goods that we buy every day. When I think about the challenges that we face in tackling ethical and responsible sourcing, and in particular modern slavery in supply chains, for me, the biggest issue is scaling. And what I mean by that is scaling our efforts to meet the size of the problem. Supply chains are vast, but the concepts that make up ethical and responsible sourcing are also vast. Child labor and forced labor probably being at the top of that list, but myriad other human rights conditions, environmental considerations, community impacts, and governance questions also play into that calculation.
Mhm.
When you take all of those issues together, a company that is trying to address responsible and ethical sourcing really has to take a lot of information, put it on a plate to try to make sense of it all, and develop a program that accounts for all of those risks. Because at the end of the day, either from a legal perspective or from an operational and reputational perspective, companies are going to have to answer for what is in their supply chains, regardless of whether they caught it or not.
Well, you say they're going to have to answer. What is the legal exposure for American companies, especially in a multi-tier supply chain, which is most supply chains? You get up past tier one, and maybe you do or don't know what's going on there. Are you exposed to liability for slave labor, modern day slavery, if you didn't know what was going on?
It depends on the legal regime, but the short answer is yes. A company can be exposed to legal liability under a number of laws related to issues in its supply chain beyond tier one. I'll try to cover some of these legal risks, but the fact is that we are at a moment of great proliferation in the laws and regulations that speak to this issue. And it's one that companies should definitely assess depending on the area of both their operations and their location. So in the US, I think that the issue that is most pressing companies to address this issue is forced labor import bans. This is a law that has been on the books for many, many years, but has only recently been ramped up in terms of enforcement efforts. And this is both on the side of general import bans, but also a specific import ban targeting a region in China. These laws basically say that if there is forced labor anywhere in your supply chain, the US government can stop goods at the border, and the burden shifts to the company to demonstrate that the goods are admissible. This is an extremely high bar, and it can be incredibly disruptive operationally to companies. We talk about legal exposure, but I think that operational disruption is important because simply being unable to get your goods into the country has significant impacts for a company that is doing business, that has
Mhm.
customers that it needs to supply, and that has operations that are continuing to run. Beyond the import bans, there are a number of laws that speak to this issue. Probably most notable from my perspective right now is something called the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, the TVPRA. And this is a law that creates liability for companies that benefit financially or otherwise from knowingly utilizing forced labor in a venture. A
Mhm.
lot of these words are subject to interpretation by courts, and we're only in early days of what that might mean. But the idea is that if a company benefits from forced labor at any point in a venture that it is engaged in, and it has knowledge of it or should have known about it, there could be both criminal liability and civil liability, meaning that the
Wow.
government can go after you or a private plaintiff can bring a claim.
Well, yeah. Go
Beyond the
on.
TVPRA, yeah, beyond the TVPRA, there are a number of smaller laws that could have significant impacts, but we're in early days of enforcement. We see issues related to public claims. If a company makes certain statements about its actions and those statements are interpreted as being inaccurate, say, for example, a company says it is 100% responsible sourced, when in fact that is potentially not the case. We can see issues in terms of securities claims, we can see issues in terms of consumer protection claims, and we can see private litigation over those concepts.
Mhm.
And moving outside the US, we have growing laws in the EU that either mandate due diligence into supply chains or require specific reporting about issues in your supply chains. Obviously, I could go on about this for a long time, but I think
Yeah.
that the headline right now is that the legal exposure is real, and this is coming not only from the US, but from jurisdictions around the world.
Few of the words that you use there can be very disconcerting to a company that can't get their arms around it. One is known or should have known. The other is due diligence. How can a company begin to exercise that amount of due diligence to ensure compliance with this massive web of rules and regulations and laws that you just described to me?
Yeah, well, I always say the same thing to every client, prospective client, or friend I meet on the street that is asking questions about this, which is look to the international principles. There are international principles published by the United Nations and the OECD about this concept of responsible sourcing in business and human rights. The concept underlies all of the new laws that we're seeing on this topic. These principles essentially track how governments are saying companies should go about managing this issue. The strategy might be different depending on the law, but the concepts are the same. Companies that are looking to manage these risks really have to take those principles and convert them into a compliance program. In the same way that we have compliance for things like taxes and trade controls and anti-corruption and all of these other concepts that are a general part of doing business, we now need to look at issues like forced labor, modern slavery, and business and human rights more generally, and incorporate them into a due diligence program that follows international principles. Doing that obviously is easier said than done, but we're seeing a lot of success on the corporate side right now of translating these concepts into actionable programs that are getting companies much closer to compliance on an area of law that is still particularly new.
And one of those actionable programs, I would imagine, is to incorporating these concerns into your contracts with suppliers. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And contracts are really your first step outside of programs within your company.
Mhm.
So when we think about contracting with suppliers and trying to manage this issue, I often think about a kind of a pyramid approach. What can we get at the base? And then how can we build on top of that to continue strengthening the structure? I mean, at its core, you want your suppliers to agree that they're going to abide by the law. There are almost no countries that don't prohibit forced labor. So that baseline agreement to comply with the law is going to be very effective.
Mhm.
But for most companies, they want to go beyond that. And there are a few ways you can do that. Some companies choose to put provisions in the contract that specifically speak to issues of forced labor and modern slavery. Others publish supplier codes of conduct that go through all the human rights and environmental and governance and other issues that suppliers should agree with. And then they either ask suppliers to agree to that code or they incorporate the code into the contract itself. This is all kind of called papering the process, meaning that we're putting it down on paper and we're getting you to agree, you, the supplier, what you're going to do. But there's another side of this, which is the actionable compliance
Yeah.
side. And that's where we move away from the contract itself and say, what are we going to do to manage the supplier during the course of the relationship? And if you want to get those rights, you really need to spell them out in the contract. Those are issues related to auditing and oversight, which can be on paper or in person, agreements to corrective action and to responding to issues, and if necessary, rights for termination if we find that a supplier is ultimately unable or unwilling to work with the company to rectify the issue that has been identified.
I'm sure, Tom, you would argue that it's a good idea for a company to get good legal help, international legal knowledge of this type of thing. But within the organization itself, should there not be somebody who is tasked with that responsibility of compliance for ethical supply chains? And if so, who should that individual be in terms of a title and a level of management?
I think this might be the question I have gotten the most over the last year.
Mhm.
And arguably, it can be any structure that depends on whatever is going to be most impactful within the company. Certainly, I would not be in a position to say that there is a particular title or role that is best suited to do this. But what I would ask of a company that's trying to get this right is how do you approach compliance, supply chains, and legal issues from a broader perspective? If you have a good system in place where there's information sharing between the people that are overseeing suppliers day to day, be that procurement or the business, for the people that are responsible for compliance, be that legal or a separate compliance function, or if it's folks that have specific sustainability roles, we're seeing human rights experts, ESG experts, international government relations experts, all finding roles within companies. The best structure I have seen is one that allows these people to communicate with one another so that issues can be identified and responded to quickly. For as much as we want to proactively get at these problems and try to manage them before they really convert into issues, there needs to be as much capability internally to respond to issues when they're identified, because we're simply going to be unable to prevent everything. So if we're able to get a structure in place that has the governance, the clearly defined roles, and the communication, we're going to be much better positioned to respond to instances of forced labor, child labor, human rights, et cetera, when they are identified.
Looking in the short term, what do you think is the greatest legal exposure that companies face today with regard to supply chain forced labor risk?
Right now in the United States, the threat of having your goods stopped at the border is the most significant. The fact is, if a company can't, as I said before, if a company can't get its goods into the United States, there are major operational and commercial impacts as a result of that. We're seeing the most enforcement activity on this front right now, and I would argue that this has prompted the most corporate activity. But looking at the issue more broadly, I think the exposure really comes down to how companies are going to operate in the global supply chain and whether there's going to be significant disruption as different companies take different approaches. As an example, one company that is operating in Europe might have significant activity with the United States, within China, within Africa, and they're going to have to deal with all these different regions' approaches to supply chain compliance and regulation while still trying to help their business run. This ecosystem of laws is going to be extremely difficult to navigate, and questions of how to set up a system that both run the business and manage for compliance risks becomes that much more complex. So the exposure here, yes, it is legal at its core because these are the laws that are driving corporate ability, corporate accountability. But when you look at the issue more broadly, it is really one of a company's ability to operate in a global network and a global commercial context when supply chains have the potential to be disrupted and significantly impact the business. I'm not sure that we have an answer to that right now, but it is certainly the consideration that drives a lot of the legal advice that I provide to my clients. It is never just legal compliance. It
Yeah.
is legal compliance with an eye towards how we keep the business going.
Well, it's a brutally complex challenge, but it's one that must be addressed today and going forward. Tom Plotkin of Covington, thank you so much for shining a light on the issue of modern day slavery and supply chains and what companies can do to prevent it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Happy to be here.